It was a quiet Friday evening in the heart of downtown Manhattan. The city, known for its restless energy, seemed to settle into an uncharacteristic calm under the glow of streetlights. A cool breeze swept through the streets, carrying with it the faint aroma of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor. Officer John Miller, a veteran cop with 15 years of service, cruised along Fifth Avenue in his squad car. His jaw was set tight, and his sharp blue eyes scanned the streets, looking for anything or anyone who might appear suspicious. Miller's reputation preceded him within the precinct. Some described him as dedicated to upholding the law, while others whispered behind closed doors about his unchecked temper and unspoken biases. Tonight, he felt restless. Earlier, his ex-wife had called, reminding him of his overdue child support payments. The mounting stress of a failing personal life and the monotony of police work seemed to compound his frustrations. As his car rolled to a stop at a red light, his gaze fell upon a lone figure walking along the sidewalk. James Carter, dressed in a plain gray hoodie and dark jeans, carried a paper bag in one hand. His broad shoulders and composed demeanor gave him an air of quiet strength. To an observer, he seemed like any ordinary man returning home after a long day. But to Miller, Carter's appearance, his dark skin, his unassuming attire was enough to trigger suspicion. Miller pulled the car over and activated the flashing blue lights. He stepped out, hand resting casually on his holstered gun. "Hey, you!" Miller called out, his tone laced with authority. "Come over here." Carter stopped in his tracks and turned slowly, his expression calm but wary. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady. "Don't play dumb," Miller snapped. "What are you doing out here? Let me see some ID." "I'm walking home," Carter replied evenly. "And I don't think I've done anything to warrant being stopped." Miller's jaw tightened. "I said, show me some ID. Now." A small crowd began to gather at a distance, their murmurs growing louder. Carter, understanding the gravity of the situation, reached into his pocket and produced his wallet. He handed Miller his driver's license without a word. Miller studied the ID with exaggerated scrutiny. "James Carter," he muttered, his tone skeptical. "What's in the bag?" "Groceries," Carter replied, holding up the paper bag. "Mind if I check?" Miller said, stepping closer without waiting for a response. He grabbed the bag and rifled through it, finding nothing but a loaf of bread and a carton of milk. His frustration grew, feeding the simmering anger beneath his professional facade. "Is this really necessary?" Carter asked, his tone calm but firm. Miller's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to question me. Watch your tone." Before Carter could respond, Miller shoved the bag back into his hands with enough force to make the milk carton wobble. Then, without warning, he grabbed Carter by the arm, twisting it behind his back. "Hey!" Carter protested, wincing. "What are you doing?" "Stop resisting," Miller barked, as if addressing a violent suspect. The crowd gasped, phones now raised to record the unfolding scene. Carter didn't struggle, his expression a mix of disbelief and controlled fury. "John, let him go!" A voice rang out from the crowd, a young woman, her tone sharp with disapproval. Miller ignored her, his grip tightening. By the time another patrol car arrived, the damage was done. The officer who stepped out of the vehicle hesitated, clearly uneasy with Miller's actions but unwilling to intervene. Carter was finally released, his wrist red and sore. Without a word, Carter gathered his belongings, his gaze locking with Miller's for a brief moment. There was no anger in Carter's eyes, only a chilling calm that sent an unspoken message. This isn't over. James Carter returned to his brownstone apartment on the Upper West Side, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the evening's events. The spacious yet modestly decorated apartment reflected his disciplined lifestyle. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with titles ranging from military strategy to modern psychology. He placed the grocery bag on the kitchen counter and ran cold water over his sore wrist, as the cool liquid numbed the ache. His mind replayed the encounter with Officer Miller. Carter had dealt with his fair share of prejudice before, but this was different. The blatant abuse of power and public humiliation stung in a way he hadn't felt in years. He moved to the living room and sank into a leather armchair. On the coffee table lay a folder stamped with the CIA emblem. James Carter wasn't just an ordinary man. He was the Deputy Director of Operations at the Central Intelligence Agency, a man who wielded influence in the highest echelons of government. Yet, tonight, none of that mattered. To Miller, he had been nothing more than a black man on the street, a target of unwarranted suspicion. Carter clenched his fists, his calm demeanor cracking. He had chosen a low-profile life outside of work, keeping his high-ranking position under wraps to protect his family. But now, the events of the evening ignited something deep within him. After a moment, he reached for his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. Pressing the call button, he brought the phone to his ear. "It's me," he said when the call connected. "I need a favor." The sound of rain tapped against the window of John Miller's cramped apartment. Empty beer cans cluttered the coffee table, and the dim glow of the television cast flickering shadows across the room. Miller sat on the couch, his head in his hands. The events of the evening replayed in his mind, not as a source of guilt but as a growing frustration. "Damn bleeding hearts," he muttered to himself, thinking of the crowd that had recorded him. He had always believed that the world was divided into us and them, law-abiding citizens and troublemakers. To him, Carter had fallen squarely into the latter category, regardless of the lack of evidence. Miller's upbringing in a working-class neighborhood had shaped his worldview. His father, a retired police sergeant, often spoke of the good old days, when cops didn't have to worry about political correctness. Those lessons had stayed with Miller, hardening him over the years. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message from his precinct captain. "We need to talk tomorrow. There's a lot of heat about that incident tonight." Miller cursed under his breath. The last thing he needed was a formal review. He turned off his phone and leaned back on the couch, the tension in his chest refusing to dissipate. At CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, a small team of operatives gathered in a secure briefing room. The atmosphere was tense yet focused. Carter stood at the head of the table, his posture commanding and his expression unreadable. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice calm yet firm, "we have a situation." He recounted the events of the previous evening in measured detail. The operatives listened intently, their faces betraying a mixture of shock and anger. Most of them had known Carter for years and respected him deeply. The idea that someone had treated him with such blatant disrespect was both infuriating and incomprehensible. "I want everything on this officer, John Miller," Carter continued. "His history, his affiliations, his connections. Leave no stone unturned." One of the operatives, a wiry man named Collins, hesitated before speaking. "Sir, are you sure you want to pursue this personally? Could get complicated." Carter's gaze hardened. "He didn't just target me. He targeted everything we stand for: justice, equality, the rule of law. I won't let this go unchecked." The room fell silent. Collins nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "We'll start digging." As the team dispersed, Carter remained seated, staring at the files before him. He knew this was only the beginning. Retribution wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that actions had consequences, no matter who committed them. For John Miller, the clock had started ticking. John Miller's shift began with an unusual quiet. As he walked into the precinct the next morning, the usual chatter among officers seemed muted. A few colleagues glanced at him, their expressions unreadable. Miller ignored it, brushing off the unease as a byproduct of the public attention surrounding the previous night. Sitting at his desk, Miller noticed a stack of paperwork, mundane reports and citations that he hadn't gotten around to finishing. He started sifting through them, but his mind was elsewhere. His captain's message from the night before lingered in his thoughts. its implications gnawing at him. Morning. Miller, Officer Daniels, one of his younger colleagues, stopped by Miller's desk. His tone was neutral, almost too casual. Daniels. Miller replied curtly, not looking up. You all right? Heard there's some chatter about last night. Miller set his pen down, irritation creeping into his voice. What about it? Daniels shrugged, but his eyes betrayed hesitation. You know how it is. People talk. Couple of videos made the rounds online. The captain's not thrilled. Miller leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. I did my job. That guy was acting suspicious. If people can't handle the truth, that's their problem. Daniels nodded slowly, but the conversation left a sour taste. As Daniels walked away, Miller's phone buzzed. He picked it up to find a text from an unknown number. How does it feel to be watched? Miller frowned, his jaw tightening. He glanced around the room but saw nothing out of the ordinary, shaking it off. He dismissed the text as a prank, likely one of those so-called activists stirring up trouble. Still, the feeling lingered. For the first time in years, John Miller felt out of control. James Carter sat in his office at CIA headquarters, his gaze fixed on a monitor displaying streams of data. His team had been working nonstop for 48 hours, piecing together the fragments of John Miller's life. A comprehensive file sat open on his desk, detailing Miller's past, his career, and his personal connections. The file painted a damning picture. Miller had joined the force at 22, following in the footsteps of his father. His early years were marked by commendations for bravery, but a closer look revealed a pattern: excessive use of force, complaints of misconduct, and allegations of racial profiling. Many of these incidents had been quietly dismissed by superiors or buried under bureaucratic red tape. One section of the file caught Carter's attention: Miller's affiliations. A series of flagged connections indicated that Miller had been attending private meetings with a group known for its extremist views on race relations. While the evidence was circumstantial: emails, social media activity, and anonymous tips, it was enough to deepen Carter's resolve. Collins, Carter called, and the wiry operative entered the room. What do we have on this group? Collins handed Carter a tablet displaying the group's manifesto and a list of suspected members. They're small but vocal. Most of their activity is online, but they've been linked to a few incidents of hate crimes in the area. Nothing that would directly implicate Miller, but the overlap is concerning. Carter's expression darkened. I want more. Follow the money, trace their communications, and keep an eye on Miller. If he's working with them, we need to know. Collins nodded and left the room. Carter leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't just about one officer's prejudice. It was about dismantling a system that allowed such behavior to thrive. And he wasn't going to stop until every thread was unraveled. A week after the incident, Captain Ray Monroe called Miller into his office. Monroe was a seasoned officer with a reputation for balancing discipline and loyalty among his team. As Miller entered, Monroe's expression was unreadable. His fingers steepled on the desk. Close the door. Miller, Monroe said. Miller complied, sitting down with a forced calm. What's this about, Captain? Monroe sighed, rubbing his temples. You've seen the videos, haven't you? I've heard about them, Miller replied tersely. Out of context. As usual, people love twisting things to fit their narrative. Maybe, Monroe said, leaning forward. But the department's under pressure. Internal Affairs is looking into your record, and the mayor's office wants answers. This isn't going away. Miller stiffened. With all due respect, Captain, I was doing my job. Monroe's gaze hardened. And I'm telling you that your job has put us all in a bad spot. We've had 2 protests outside the station this week. I need to know. Are there skeletons in your closet I should know about? Miller hesitated, his pulse quickening. Nothing that hasn't already been dealt with. Monroe didn't look convinced. I'm giving you a chance to come clean. Miller, don't make me regret it. Before Miller could respond, Monroe's desk phone rang, breaking the tense silence. Monroe answered, his brow furrowing as he listened. "All right, send them in," he said, hanging up. "We're done here for now. But Miller, keep your head down." As Miller left the office, he noticed two men in suits entering the precinct. They didn't look like cops. Something about them set his nerves on edge. Meanwhile, Carter's quiet plan began to gain traction. A carefully orchestrated leak to a local journalist had brought Miller's history into the public eye. Headlines questioned the integrity of the police department, and more videos of Miller's past encounters surfaced. The media frenzy painted Miller as a symbol of systemic injustice. At the precinct, Miller felt the walls closing in. Fellow officers avoided him, their conversations halting whenever he entered a room. Even Daniels, who had been cordial days before, now kept his distance. Miller's unease turned to paranoia. His phone buzzed with anonymous messages at all hours, cryptic warnings, veiled threats, and reminders that his actions were under scrutiny. At home, he noticed unfamiliar cars parked on his street, their occupants lingering just long enough to fuel his suspicions. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, Miller's phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. "What do you want?" he barked into the receiver. A calm, measured voice replied, "Officer Miller, how does it feel to lose control?" Miller's heart pounded. "Who is this?" The line went dead. The call shook him, not because of the words, but because the voice was hauntingly familiar. It wasn't until hours later that he placed it. The man from that night, James Carter. Unbeknownst to Miller, Carter was orchestrating every detail, pulling strings from behind the scenes. For Carter, this was more than personal. It was a calculated dismantling of a man who represented everything wrong with the system. And as the pressure mounted, Carter knew that Miller's next move would determine the final outcome. The city buzzed with tension as protests erupted outside the police precinct. What had started as a small gathering of concerned citizens swelled into a massive demonstration. Banners reading "Justice for All" and "No More Police Brutality" waved high in the air, while chants of anger and determination echoed through the streets. James Carter watched the news coverage from his office, his expression unreadable. His plan was working. The carefully leaked evidence of Officer John Miller's misconduct, coupled with Carter's strategic use of social media, had ignited a firestorm. For the first time in years, the public seemed united in their demand for accountability. At the precinct, Miller sat in a conference room with his captain and a representative from Internal Affairs. His fists clenched as the IA officer laid out the mounting allegations against him. "We've received complaints going back over a decade, Officer Miller," the IA officer said, flipping through a thick file. "Excessive force, racial profiling, and now this video of you assaulting Mr. Carter. It's not looking good." Miller bristled. "That video doesn't tell the whole story. He was acting suspicious. I did what I was trained to do." The captain leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Your training isn't the issue. It's your pattern of behavior. And now the whole city's watching. You're becoming a liability." Miller slammed his hand on the table, his voice rising. "I've given 15 years to this job. I put my life on the line every day. And this is how I'm treated? Because some thug decided to cry foul." The room fell silent, the word thug hanging heavy in the air. The IA officer exchanged a glance with the captain, who sighed deeply. "Effective immediately. You're suspended without pay," the captain said, his tone final. "Turn in your badge and gun." Miller's face reddened, a mix of rage and humiliation boiling over. But he had no choice. He unfastened his badge and placed it on the table with a metallic clink, then handed over his service weapon. As Miller stormed out of the precinct, he could hear the chants of protesters outside. Their voices were deafening, a stark reminder that the public was no longer on his side. James Carter sat in a dimly lit conference room. His team of CIA operatives gathered around him. The atmosphere was tense, yet focused. A large screen at the end of the table displayed a detailed map of Miller's known associates and movements. Red lines connected names and locations, forming a web of potential leads. Collins, what do we have on his connections to the extremist group? Carter asked, his voice calm but commanding. Collins clicked a remote, zooming in on a section of the map. We've traced several communications between Miller and members of the group. Emails, encrypted messages, nothing explicit, but enough to suggest he's more involved than he claims. Carter nodded, his expression darkening. And their funding? Bank records show transfers from anonymous accounts. We're tracking the source, but it's taking time. Time was a luxury Carter didn't have. The public outrage was reaching a boiling point, and the longer this dragged on, the more dangerous Miller and his allies could become. Carter leaned back in his chair, considering his options. Focus on the financials, he said finally. If we can cut off their funding, we cripple their operations. Collins nodded, but before he could leave, Carter added, and keep eyes on Miller. He's desperate now. Desperate men make reckless choices. Miller, meanwhile, was spiraling, with no job, no allies, and a growing sense of paranoia. He spent his days drinking and pacing his apartment. The calls and messages from anonymous numbers continued, each one more cryptic than the last. One evening, as he sat in the darkness of his living room, his laptop pinged with a notification. An email from an unknown sender read, "You're not the only one who's been watching." Attached was a file containing surveillance footage of him. Miller's blood ran cold as he watched himself on screen, walking to his car, entering his apartment, even sitting in this very room. Someone had been tracking his every move. His hands shook as he typed a response. "Who are you? What do you want?" The reply came almost instantly, "Justice." The pressure on Miller reached its peak when local news outlets aired an exclusive segment about his alleged ties to the extremist group. The report was damning, showing emails and financial transactions that painted him as a sympathizer, if not an active participant. Miller watched in horror as his face appeared on screen, accompanied by headlines like "Disgraced Officer Linked to Hate Group" and "Police Corruption Exposed." He grabbed his phone and called one of his old colleagues, Officer Daniels. "Daniels, you've got to help me," he pleaded. "You know this is all bullshit. They're setting me up." Daniels' response was cold. "Sorry, John. You're on your own." Click. Miller threw the phone across the room, shattering it against the wall. The isolation was suffocating. His former friends and colleagues had abandoned him, and the media had turned him into a villain. Desperate for answers, Miller decided to confront the one person he believed was behind it all, James Carter. Carter wasn't surprised when his security team informed him that Miller was outside his apartment building. The surveillance cameras showed Miller pacing back and forth, his face a mixture of rage and desperation. "Let him in," Carter said calmly, instructing his team to stand by. Minutes later, Miller was escorted into Carter's apartment. The contrast between the two men was stark. Carter, composed and commanding, versus Miller, disheveled and seething with anger. "You," Miller spat, pointing a trembling finger at Carter. "You did this to me." Carter leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Did what? Exactly?" "Ruined my life," Miller shouted. "The videos, the leaks, the lies about me and that group. It's all you." Carter stood, his imposing presence silencing Miller. "Nothing I've done is a lie, Officer Miller. Everything that's come out is the truth. The only thing I've done is shine a light on it." "You don't understand." Miller's voice cracked. "I was just doing my job. You think you're some hero, but you've destroyed me." Carter stepped closer, his voice low and measured. "You destroyed yourself. Every choice you made, every abuse of power, it led you here. I didn't have to ruin your life. You did that all on your own." Miller's shoulders slumped, the weight of Carter's words sinking in. For a moment, he looked like a broken man, but then his eyes hardened. "You think this is over?" he growled. "You think you've won?" Carter's gaze didn't waver. "It's not about winning. It's about justice. And it's far from over." Miller stormed out, leaving Carter alone with his thoughts. He knew Miller wasn't finished, but neither was he. The battle for accountability was just beginning, and Carter was prepared for whatever came next. The revelations about John Miller's history and alleged ties to extremist groups sent shockwaves through the city. News outlets dissected every detail of his career, amplifying public outrage. Across the nation, discussions about police reform and systemic racism dominated social media and primetime television. For James Carter, the ripple effect was both expected and necessary. From his office at CIA headquarters, he monitored the broader impact of his plan. The leaks had achieved their goal. Miller was no longer the problem of one man, but a symbol of a broken system that needed to be fixed. Carter's phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was Collins. "We've traced the funding," Collins said without preamble. "The extremist group Miller was tied to has been receiving money from a shell corporation with ties to several high-profile individuals." Carter frowned. "Names?" Collins hesitated. "One of them is a sitting congressman. We're verifying the others." The implications were staggering. Carter leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't just about one corrupt officer or a fringe group. It was about a network of power and influence that enabled such behavior to persist. "Keep digging," Carter said finally, "and prepare a report. This goes deeper than we thought." As the call ended, Carter stared at the map on his screen. Red lines connected names, locations, and financial transactions, forming a web of corruption and complicity. The fight was far from over. Meanwhile, on the streets, the protests grew larger and more organized. Civil rights leaders, community activists, and even some law enforcement officers joined the movement. They called for sweeping reforms, better accountability, mandatory body cameras, and the removal of officers with histories of misconduct. For Officer Daniels, the shift was personal. Watching his colleagues distance themselves from Miller had forced him to confront his own biases. Daniels began attending community meetings, listening to the grievances of residents who had long felt targeted by the police. "It's not just about one officer," a young activist told him during one meeting. "It's about a system that lets people like Miller thrive." Daniels nodded, the words hitting him harder than he expected. He realized that true change would require more than words. It would require action. The investigation into Miller's ties to the extremist group gained momentum as more evidence came to light. Bank records, intercepted communications, and witness testimonies painted a clear picture. Miller wasn't just a passive sympathizer. He had actively participated in planning and funding activities meant to intimidate minority communities. Carter's team worked tirelessly to compile a comprehensive dossier. It was a meticulous effort, requiring them to navigate legal and bureaucratic hurdles while maintaining absolute secrecy. The stakes were higher than ever. If even a hint of their investigation leaked, the entire operation could be compromised. Collins entered Carter's office one evening, holding a thick folder. "We've got enough to take this public," he said, placing the folder on Carter's desk. "But we'll need clearance from the top." Carter flipped through the documents, his expression unreadable. The evidence was damning: emails between Miller and group leaders, photos of secret meetings, and even recordings of conversations that revealed their plans. "This isn't just about Miller anymore," Carter said quietly. "This is about dismantling the entire network." Collins nodded. "What's the play?" Carter's gaze hardened. "We go to the DOJ. If they won't act, we make it impossible for them not to." Meanwhile, Miller's world continued to crumble. After his confrontation with Carter, he found himself spiraling deeper into paranoia. He saw enemies everywhere, in his neighbors, in the media, even in his own reflection. His isolation became suffocating, and the weight of his choices pressed down on him like a vice. One evening, a knock at his door startled him. He grabbed a kitchen knife, his hand trembling as he approached. "Who is it?" he demanded. "It's Daniels," came the reply. "We need to talk." Miller hesitated before opening the door. Daniels stepped inside. His expression conflicted. "What do you want?" Miller snapped. Daniels took a deep breath. "I'm here because you need to face the truth, John. You've done things that can't be undone. But you can still make this right." Miller laughed bitterly. "Make it right? You think apologizing will fix this?" "No," Daniels said firmly. "But cooperating might. There's an investigation. They're closing in on you. If you come clean now, maybe, just maybe, you'll have a chance to salvage what's left." Miller's face hardened. "Get out." Daniels stared at him for a long moment before turning to leave. "Think about it, John. You can't run from this forever." As the investigation neared its climax, Carter prepared for a critical meeting with the Department of Justice. The evidence his team had gathered was overwhelming, but he knew the political and legal hurdles would be immense. Corruption ran deep, and exposing it would make powerful enemies. The meeting took place in a secure conference room at DOJ headquarters. Carter presented his findings to a panel of senior officials, walking them through the intricate web of corruption that connected Miller, the extremist group, and their financial backers. "This isn't just about one officer," Carter concluded. "It's about a network that has infiltrated law enforcement, politics, and business. If we don't act now, the damage will only get worse." The officials exchanged glances, their expressions grave. After what felt like an eternity, the lead investigator spoke. "We'll initiate proceedings," she said. "But this will be a long and difficult process." Carter nodded. "I understand, but justice is worth the effort." Back in the city, Miller finally reached his breaking point. The weight of his actions, combined with the constant surveillance and public vilification, left him teetering on the edge. One night, he sat at his desk, staring at a blank piece of paper. After hours of agonizing contemplation, he began to write. The letter was part confession, part plea for forgiveness. He detailed his involvement with the extremist group, his abuses of power, and the factors that had driven him down this path. He didn't expect redemption, but he hoped that telling the truth might offer a sliver of atonement. The next morning, Miller delivered the letter to a local journalist before turning himself in to the authorities. The news spread quickly, igniting a new wave of outrage but also sparking conversations about accountability and reform. With Miller's confession and the DOJ's investigation underway, the tide began to turn. High-profile arrests followed, including members of the extremist group and their financial backers. The public watched as the network of corruption unraveled, vindicating the efforts of activists and whistleblowers. For Carter, the victory was bittersweet. He had achieved his goal, but the cost had been high. The fight had consumed months of his life, leaving little time for anything else. As he walked through the streets of the city one evening, he saw signs of hope. Community members organizing cleanup efforts, police officers engaging with residents, and protesters celebrating the progress they had made. Carter stopped at a corner, watching as a young girl painted a mural on a brick wall. The image depicted a diverse group of people holding hands, with the words "Justice for All" written above them. "Beautiful, isn't it?" a voice said behind him. Carter turned to see Daniels, his expression thoughtful. "It's a start," Carter replied. Daniels nodded. "We've still got a long way to go, but maybe, just maybe, we're heading in the right direction." As Carter walked away, he felt a sense of quiet resolve. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he believed that real change was possible. Months after the initial firestorm, the city was beginning to heal. However, the scars of systemic injustice were still visible, and the need for action was undeniable. James Carter found himself at the forefront of a new initiative, a joint task force aimed at rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. The task force's first public event was held at a local community center. Police officers, city officials, and residents gathered in an uneasy mix, their interactions tentative but hopeful. Carter, in his usual reserved manner, observed the proceedings from a distance. His presence wasn't widely publicized. He preferred to let the work speak for itself. Officer Daniels, now a vocal advocate for reform, stood at the center of the room. He spoke candidly about his own experiences and the lessons he had learned since Miller's downfall. Change starts with accountability, Daniels said, his voice steady. But it doesn't end there. We have to rebuild trust, not with words, but with actions. The crowd erupted in applause, but Carter noticed the skepticism in some faces. Change, he knew, wouldn't come easily. After the event, he approached Daniels, who was shaking hands with residents. "Good speech," Carter said, extending his hand. Daniels hesitated for a moment before shaking it. "Coming from you, that means a lot. Don't let it go to your head," Carter replied with a rare smile. "This is just the beginning." The two men parted ways, both knowing that the road ahead would be long and difficult. John Miller sat in a dimly lit interrogation room. His once imposing figure now hunched and diminished. The walls seemed to close in on him, a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. Across from him sat two federal agents, their expressions neutral but their questions cutting. "You've admitted to your involvement with the extremist group," one agent said, flipping through a file. "But we need more names, dates, locations." Miller clenched his fists, his mind a whirlwind of regret and defiance. "I've already told you everything," he muttered. "Not everything," the agent pressed. "You still have a chance to help yourself. Cooperate, and we'll consider a reduced sentence." Miller hesitated. He knew the group's inner workings, its members, and its plans better than anyone. But cooperating felt like another betrayal, this time of the twisted ideals he had once clung to. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. As the agents left the room, Miller leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, he allowed himself to confront the weight of his actions, the lives he had ruined, the trust he had betrayed. It was a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. Outside the interrogation room, Carter watched through a one-way mirror. He had pushed for Miller to be given this opportunity, believing that even the most flawed individuals were capable of redemption. But whether Miller would take it remained to be seen. The arrest and prosecution of Miller and his associates had sparked a national conversation about police reform. Cities across the country began implementing new policies aimed at preventing abuse and ensuring accountability. Carter's task force became a model for similar initiatives nationwide. One afternoon, Carter received a call from Collins. "We've got news," Collins said. "The DOJ wants you to testify before Congress about the investigation." Carter frowned. "What good will that do?" "Visibility," Collins replied. "If we want lasting change, we need to keep this in the public eye." Carter agreed, albeit reluctantly. He had always preferred working behind the scenes, but he understood the importance of this moment. His testimony before Congress was measured and powerful, detailing the systemic issues he had uncovered and the steps needed to address them. "We cannot afford to look away," Carter concluded. "This isn't just about one officer or one city. It's about a culture that allows prejudice and abuse to thrive. And if we're serious about change, we need to act now." His words resonated across the nation, sparking renewed calls for reform. But Carter knew that speeches and policies weren't enough. The real work lay in changing hearts and minds. A year after the initial confrontation between Carter and Miller, the city held a commemorative event in honor of the progress made. The event was hosted at a public park, where residents, activists, and officials gathered to reflect on the journey they had undertaken together. Carter stood near the back of the crowd, watching as speakers took the stage. Daniels was among them, his transformation from a disillusioned officer to a champion of reform evident in every word he spoke. "We're not here to celebrate the end of something," Daniels said, We're here to mark the beginning of something new, a future where justice truly means justice for all. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the park. Carter allowed himself a small smile, his usually stoic demeanor softening for a moment. As the event concluded, a young girl approached Carter, clutching a notebook. "Are you Mr. Carter?" she asked, her voice shy. "I am," Carter replied, crouching to her level. "My mom says you helped make things better," she said, holding out the notebook. "Can you sign this?" Carter hesitated, unaccustomed to such gestures, but the hope in her eyes convinced him. He signed the notebook and handed it back, his expression thoughtful. As the sun set over the park, Carter felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The battle for justice was far from over, but for the first time in years, he felt that progress was possible. Walking away from the crowd, Carter reflected on everything that had led to this moment. The pain, the sacrifices, the hard-won victories, it had all been worth it. And as he looked toward the horizon, he felt a renewed determination to keep fighting for a better future.